following the Civil War, we talk about all of these different identities of nationalism brewing leading to the Civil War. How did the nation unite and develop a common nationalism following the Civil War? How did they mend those schisms?
But the reality is, it was more or less achieved at the expense of African Americans. I mean, that's what reconciliation came down to. Frederick Douglass was right about that. Reconstruction, a serious effort is made to make African American citizens. That's more or less abandoned. The South is allowed to, well, do what it wants, essentially. And African Americans basically, okay, they're no longer slaves, that's gone, but they now find themselves as second class citizens or even third class citizens. Um, and the other thing that unites is other, namely the Spanish. The Spanish American War is crucial in bringing the South back into the Union. It's this national pride of taking on another foreigner as opposed to fighting each other. So I do think it's a lot of the same issues, that take place. Othering of an internal African American, and then the external threat, the Spanish, helps bring about national unity.
I would actually go a different route. I agree on part with Duncan, but I think on another level that there wasn't as much unity as we like to think, because it is in the not in the immediate because in the immediate aftermath of the war with Reconstruction, of course, we have what some historians have now described as sort of a um, southern internal civil war, where African Americans with military units, militia units, and white Southerners fight each other, and it's sort of a power struggle for who eventually emerges out of Reconstruction successfully. We know the answer to that already. We see at the end of the 19th century, we see emergence of the United Confederate Veteran, United Daughters of the Confederacy, and Sons of Confederate Veterans. You get all these organizations that want to commemorate the lost cause, a skewed version of American history of the American Civil War, and and they put up monuments all over the place, right? So from my perspective, at least, the Southern national identity isn't dead. It reinvented itself with a lost cause, but it continues on. And you really see that, and that's why I was very glad we included a chapter on memory in the book, because it is a clashing point for the people, right? You look at Chattanooga, as a Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park when it's created, and the veterans themselves are making an effort, leaders in the veterans groups are making an effort to create this park. One, Chickamauga U.S. Confederate victory, Chattanooga U.S. victory. So there is for both sides something here. And it's marketed to Congress as a place for reconciliation, right? To bring the country back together. Like Duncan says, we're right at the edge here of the war with Spain. So it's this moment where we want that unity. And you look at the speeches, you look at the things people say in the lead up to this. And I always like that Gazette from Ohio that says that it makes a true soldier's blood boil to see these battlefields marked with rebel monuments. So that the veterans themselves, U.S. veterans, they weren't looking for reconciliation. They didn't look at Southerners, at least veterans from the war, as again fellow countrymen. Right? They didn't quite forgive this, and I think that sort of we want to see the country as coming together, and we kind of see Native Americans or African Americans or Chinese or Japanese as sort of the othering eventually that kind of helps unify white people in the country, and Spain as the enemy in the War of 1898. But if we look at the conversation still today, this is Southern nationalism is existing. It's strong with some parts of in some parts of the country. So I I would actually push against that and say it's not quite over. It's not quite that union has been fully reestablished.
That's an interesting point about Union soldiers and their blood boiling. That the battlefields are littered with Confederate monuments. They didn't see them as their countrymen. That's an interesting point. But going back to what Duncan said about um, the conclusion of the Civil War, basically at the expense of African Americans, I'm going to sort of offer a hot take for the sake of conversation. And I'm going to say that the South actually won the Civil War. And here's why. Following the Constitutional Convention, we had the Three-Fifths Clause, which gave African Americans three-fifths representation in government. They didn't have the right to vote, but they had three-fifths of their population represented in government. Following the Civil War and the abolition of that, the abolition of slavery, we can now identify what we can call the Five-Fifths Clause. Now they were fully representative in government, and they had the right to vote, but because of Southern repression of voting, literacy clause, literally literacy tests and grandfather clauses, poll taxes, all sorts of these things, they still weren't really able to vote. But now they had full representation in Congress, which really just gave Southerners much more political power.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, I would agree. But I would not stretch it as far as a certain historian who actually puts that on her book cover. Because, I mean, in the end, the United States did win, right? The free labor ideology of the United States has permeated into the South. You can make a case that the South and the West kind of are in an imperial industrial economic relationship with the North and Midwestern sort of industrial power of the United States. So,
But I would also add African Americans weren't exactly passive either, because you had the great migrations even before civil rights, where African Americans kind of spread out across the country. In many ways, you could say that by getting out of the South, they reclaimed some certain aspects of Reconstruction. And the success varied from place to place. I think that's vital too. Um, the trouble, of course, always comes down to the fact that most Northerners did not, in fact, care for African Americans that much before the Civil War began. I mean, we know about, for instance, many of the Western states wouldn't allow black migration in there, free or enslaved. It's so in some ways it's one of these aspects that is sometimes perhaps forgotten about or not paid enough attention to. And it was Jesse Jackson, I believe, who said the U.S. didn't become a democracy till the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because until then, ultimately, African Americans in many places of the U.S. did not actually have the vote, despite the fact they're constitutionally guaranteed it. So, I mean, what do we end the American Civil War in 1965 instead of 1865, as Mr. Jackson would have it? I don't know. I mean, this is where it comes down to. I will say, though, there was a serious, I mean, I take Niels' point about the veterans, but there was a serious attempt at reconciliation after Reconstruction. And there was a serious campaign in terms of American textbooks and so forth, writers and stuff, trying to emphasize the valor on both sides and downplay slavery. So, I mean, there was, again, with this imagined community, there was a lot of imagining going on. And for instance, Theodore Roosevelt, the president, he was a nephew of James T. Bullock, who built the Confederate cruisers in Britain. So, and the two met and all the rest of it. So there was a serious attempt to try bring about reconciliation, which is also about imagining a nation. And I think that's important too. That is another aspect. It wasn't necessarily a natural coming together, as Niels points out. There was also quite unnatural, dare I say, propagandist aspect to it as well. And it's like, yeah, I mean, look at the film "The Birth of a Nation" by Griffiths. I mean, that's an example of propaganda right there, and it's a very effective propaganda.
well, and I would add to that too, right? Kind of like building on what you're saying, that the focus of the country shifts by the end of Reconstruction. That eventually this there we say Southern problem gets pushed aside because the Western problem is bigger. And the focus of the country turns west, right? Like send people into the West, like assimilate Native Americans, like pacify the West, build more railroad connections through the country, exploit oil, mining, gold, silver reserves out there. And that kind of then eventually leads into the imperial push of the United States. So it's sort of, okay, this is over. Let's move on to things that are more interesting for the country. It's sort of like, right, it's the kids that has, oh, the old toy is broken and damaged and it's not interesting anymore. Oh, there's a new birthday gift and toys that I can now play with. And that's the American West.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Going back to what Duncan said earlier about the Spanish American War, war unites people. As unfortunate as it is, it's an interesting phenomenon throughout history in that war tends to bring people together with, a common cause. If you've ever read 1984, that's why they're always at war with East Asia, is to keep the people with a common enemy. It keeps them sort of submissive and united.